Whispers in the shadows. In the dark, silent reaches of my small hometown in the Midwest, an undercurrent of fear began to flow. A fear rooted in shadows that stretched far beyond what most people could fathom. It started innocuously, the kind of peculiar things that adults and children alike would dismiss with a shrug or a nervous laugh. But as I grew older, I realized the strange stories and hushed murmurs of townsfolk weren't mere superstitions. They were fragments of an unsettling reality that few dared to acknowledge openly. Before entering the story, please subscribe to help TMI Stories reach 1,000 subscribers. It was in these twilight hours of unease that I first encountered the stories of the black-eyed children. They seemed like something straight out of an old folk tale, except for the stories people told of them right here, in our quiet town, and the distinct memory of cold fear that hung around those who'd encountered them. Small groups of kids, ranging from 6 to 12 years old, would stand at someone's door late at night, their eyes cold, impossibly black and glistening. They would ask, in soft but insistent tones, to be let inside. Their voices held a strange hypnotic quality, a demand wrapped in politeness. As the story went, these children rarely left until the door had been slammed shut, and even then, the feeling of something dark lingered in the homes they visited. The fear of these children spread, as did tales of encounters with them. But it wasn't only children who haunted the shadows. There were stories of strange men, always dressed in identical, ill-fitting black suits, their skin pale, their features almost human but subtly wrong, as if some vital spark was missing from them. They would appear in pairs, arriving at the homes of those who had seen things they couldn't explain. Unusual lights in the sky, mysterious figures lurking in fields at night, encounters with apparitions or voices that whispered from empty rooms. These men would arrive unannounced, and as one witness recalled, it felt as if they knew things they shouldn't. Their visits ended with the same silent warning, "Stay silent," or something worse would follow. And then there were the women. People spoke of the women in black almost reluctantly, as if saying their names too loud might draw them nearer. Unlike their male counterparts, the women in black rarely approached with questions. They were watchers. I had first heard of them from my friend Mara, who had spent her entire life in our small town and had developed a keen sense for things that didn't belong. One autumn night, Mara had spotted a woman watching her from a corner of the park. Her clothes were dark, her hair concealed by a wide-brimmed hat, and her face was barely visible in the dim light. But something about her presence was unmistakably wrong. She stood without moving for what felt like hours, her face never fully illuminated, but her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, as if reflecting a light that wasn't there. Mara said that the woman watched her without blinking, without shifting her weight, her face an unreadable mask. She described the encounter in tones laced with fear, adding only that the next morning she had woken to find a single, unmarked black book on her porch. It contained no title, no words, only blank, slightly yellowed pages that seemed to stare back at her. From that day on, Mara changed. She grew more secretive, more guarded, her gaze frequently darting to the windows, as though afraid of what she might see there. And then, one day, she was simply gone. Her family said she had left town without a word, but I always suspected she was lost to something darker. The tales of these black-eyed children, the men and women in black, began to gnaw at me as I pieced together Mara's story and the fragments I'd overheard from others. It was more than superstition. It was a warning, an unsolved riddle lingering in the air like smoke from an unseen fire. Yet there was something even more unsettling that began to circle in my mind. The town library held a collection of unusual books, largely dismissed by the librarian as curiosities. I remember the first time I laid my hands on one of them. The cover was black, the spine cracked with age, but the pages were perfectly blank. It had been tucked on the bottom shelf of a dusty section filled with old encyclopedias and books no one ever borrowed. Intrigued, I checked it out and brought it home, thinking nothing of it. That night, I had the most vivid dreams. I dreamed of the woman Mara had described, watching me from the edge of a dimly lit street, her face shrouded, her eyes glimmering. In the dream, she held out her hand, palm up, revealing something I couldn't quite see. I woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. I felt even then that the book had stirred something old, something that shouldn't be tampered with. As days passed, I became aware of subtle shifts around me. Strangers with pale, unnaturally smooth skin passed me in town, their gaze lingering a fraction too long. I began to notice the same black-suited figures Mara had described, standing at corners or in parking lots, only to vanish when I looked twice. It felt as though the book had left a mark on me, an invitation, or perhaps a warning, and it was then that I realized I wasn't alone in this. There were others in town who had touched the same darkness. The shadows had begun to close in, a little more each day, whispering secrets that hinted at a world existing just out of reach of the ordinary. Uninvited visitors, sleep eluded me after that first night with the book. The dreams had returned, relentless, each one a little more vivid than the last. The faceless woman appeared again and again, her dark shape lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I'd see her in crowds, hidden in the shadows between streetlights, or standing silently in doorways, as though waiting for some unspoken signal. Each time she held out her hand, and each time I felt the pull of something deeper, something I wasn't yet ready to face. It was one of those sleepless nights, the second or third since finding the book, when I first heard the knock at my door. It came faintly at first, a slow, gentle tapping that barely registered in the quiet of my small apartment. But it grew louder, more insistent, each knock pressing against my chest, making my heart pound harder. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would stop. But when the sound came again, my body tensed, every nerve on edge. I crept to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the peephole, half expecting it to be empty, a trick of my imagination. But as I leaned in, I froze. There, just beyond the door, stood two figures. They wore dark suits, their faces a sickly pale, almost translucent, with eyes that seemed to bore through the door and into my very mind. One of them, a man with a thin, unnaturally wide smile, raised his hand and knocked again, slowly, deliberately. A chill ran down my spine as he spoke, his voice soft but oddly metallic, as though it had been artificially modulated. "We'd like to speak with you, if you don't mind," he said, his tone polite but hollow, lacking any real warmth. "May we come in?" My hand gripped the doorknob, my instincts screaming at me to keep it shut. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The other figure, a woman with long, straight hair and eyes that seemed slightly too large for her face, tilted her head. "We're just friends. Nothing to worry about," she replied, her voice a mirror of the man's, mechanical, almost inhuman. "We're here to discuss the book you borrowed. We understand you have questions." A shiver ran down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about the book, hadn't mentioned it to a soul, and yet here they were, speaking of it as though they'd known all along. My fingers tightened on the doorknob, but I didn't turn it. "I'm not interested," I managed to say, though my voice betrayed my fear. There was a pause, and then slowly, the woman leaned closer, her face filling the peephole, her unblinking eyes like two black holes, sucking in the light. "You misunderstand," she whispered. "The book is no ordinary book. You opened a door, and now it cannot be closed so easily." I staggered back, pulling away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The knocking resumed, louder now, each impact like a hammer against my chest. I backed away, retreating into the living room, clutching the book as though it could somehow protect me. The knocking persisted, rhythmic, unrelenting, each knock sending a wave of dread deeper into my bones. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence fell over the apartment, thick and oppressive, broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heartbeat. I held my breath, waiting, listening, but no sound came. After a few long minutes, I dared to approach the door again, peering cautiously through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I took a shaky breath, relief mingling with confusion. I locked the door, double-checking it twice before stepping back. But the sense of safety was short-lived, replaced by a gnawing unease as I felt the weight of the book in my hands. It felt heavier than before, as though it carried more than just its pages within its covers. The next morning, I decided to return the book. I dressed hurriedly, glancing over my shoulder at every creak and shadow as I made my way to the library. When I arrived, I found the librarian, a kind but somewhat eccentric woman named Judith, shelving books in the far corner. She looked up as I approached, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the book in my hands. "You're returning that already?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "I didn't think anyone even knew it existed." I hesitated, clutching the book tighter. I don't think I should keep it. It's doing something. Or drawing something," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempt to keep it steady. Judith's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing. "There's a reason no one takes it out," she said quietly. "It's said to be a conduit, a doorway, if you believe in that sort of thing. The kind of book that, once opened, starts unraveling things better left alone." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Did anyone visit you?" I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily in my chest. "Two people, dressed in black. They knew things. About the book, about me. They tried to get inside." Judith's face grew pale. She glanced around the library, as though expecting to see them lurking in the shadows. The men in black, she murmured, more to herself than to me. They're not just legends, they're guardians of sorts, but not in the way you'd hope. I opened my mouth to speak, but Judith held up a hand, stopping me. If they're interested in you, it's already too late to undo what's been started. Returning the book won't change that now. She gave me a somber look. But there is something you can do, something to delay them, at least for a time. She pulled a piece of chalk from her pocket, handing it to me. Take this. Draw a circle around yourself before you sleep, and keep the book close. The circle will hold them back, but only if your will is strong enough. I took the chalk, my fingers trembling, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and fear. Will that really work? She hesitated, her expression troubled. For a time, but be warned, this isn't over, they'll keep coming. They don't just take no for an answer. She glanced down at the book in my hands, her gaze hardening. And whatever you do, don't let them inside. Once they're in, they're impossible to remove. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, then thanked her and left the library, the weight of her warning pressing down on me like a physical burden. That night, as the sun set and shadows gathered once more, I took the chalk and carefully drew a circle around my bed. The air felt thick, charged with a strange energy, and as I lay down, I held the book close, its blank pages a silent companion in the growing darkness. But as the minutes turned to hours, I felt the first faint knock at my door. The first warning. The knocking was soft at first, so gentle that it was easy to pretend it wasn't real. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness above me, the book clutched against my chest. But as the seconds stretched on, the knock became louder, more insistent, a steady, hollow beat that reverberated through my apartment. My hands shook as I drew the blanket tighter around me, the chalk circle at the edges of my bed, a thin line of hope against the night. Then, the knocking stopped. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy, pressing down on me until it felt as though I might drown in it. I waited, my heart racing, bracing myself for whatever might come next. A soft voice called my name from the other side of the door. It was a child's voice, soft, uncertain, but familiar in the way a half-forgotten memory might be. "Please," it whispered, the sound barely more than a breath. "Please let me in." I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. I knew, instinctively, that it wasn't a real child on the other side of that door. The voice was too perfect, too carefully crafted, like an echo or a mimicry of something human. Yet the words struck at the core of me, tugging at some primal instinct, as though whatever was outside had reached directly into my mind to find the voice that would unnerve me the most. The knocking resumed, a little louder this time. My name drifted through the air again, this time tinged with a pleading note. "I'm cold," it whispered. "Please, just let me in." I clutched the book tighter, feeling its strange, unnatural weight settle against my chest. It was cold to the touch, the leather of its cover dry and cracked, as though the book itself had aged in the short time I'd had it. I glanced down at it, a shiver running through me as I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint etching on the corner of the cover, a symbol scratched into the leather that I couldn't make out in the dark. Another knock, sharp and insistent. My name echoed again, and this time I heard it more clearly, a note of anger woven into the words. "I know you're in there," the voice said, its tone shifting, becoming sharper, harsher. "You have to let me in. It's not fair to keep me out." My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. "Go away," I whispered, my voice trembling. I doubted it would make a difference, but I had to try. There was a pause, and then the voice spoke again, softer this time, more patient. "Please," it whispered. "I'm scared. I don't want to be alone out here." The voice twisted at something deep inside me, an urge to protect, to help. I closed my eyes, fighting the temptation to open the door to see what was waiting there. But Judith's words echoed in my mind. Once they're in, they're impossible to remove. The voice grew louder, more frantic, pleading with a desperation that sent chills down my spine. "Please, please, just for a minute, I won't hurt you, I promise." I kept my eyes shut, my breath shallow and quick, willing myself to ignore it, to pretend I was somewhere else. The knocking intensified, each pound echoing through the room, rattling the walls, the bed, even the air itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence returned, deeper and more oppressive than before. I stayed where I was, barely daring to breathe, afraid that any movement might somehow invite the thing outside to come closer. Minutes passed, and slowly, the tension in the room began to fade, the air lightening as though a storm had passed. I took a shaky breath, daring to open my eyes. The room was empty, as it had been before. The chalk circle remained unbroken, a fragile line of protection between me and whatever lurked outside. I took a moment to steady myself, to convince myself that it was truly gone, before daring to climb out of bed. My legs shook as I stepped out of the circle, the cool floor grounding me as I made my way to the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening, but no sound came from the other side. Just to be certain, I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, no sign of movement or disturbance. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. But as I turned to go back to bed, my eyes caught on something, a thin slip of paper that had been slid under the door. My stomach twisted as I crouched down, reaching for it with trembling fingers. The paper was rough, as though torn hastily from a book, and as I unfolded it, my heart skipped a beat. It was a page from the book I had borrowed, a single, yellowed sheet with words scrawled in a neat, looping hand. The words were faded, barely visible, but I could just make out the first line. To open a door is to invite a shadow. I felt my blood run cold as I read the line again, trying to make sense of it. The words pulsed in my mind, echoing the unspoken warning Judith had given me. Beneath the line there were faint marks, symbols that I couldn't decipher, etched into the page like scars. They looked ancient, their meaning lost to time, but they held an undeniable power, a sense of something dark and binding. As I stared at the page, a strange feeling washed over me, a sense of being watched, as though eyes were tracking my every movement from the shadows. I looked up, half expecting to see someone standing in the hallway, but there was nothing there. Only the faint flicker of the hallway light, casting twisted shadows on the walls. I clutched the paper, my mind racing. The knock, the voice, the message, all of it was connected, all of it leading me deeper into something I couldn't yet understand. I needed answers, needed to know what was happening to me, and why these things, these entities, were so interested in the book. But I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. The warning had been given, and the shadows were waiting. I returned to the bed, the paper still in my hand, and glanced at the book. A new determination filled me. I couldn't ignore this any longer, couldn't hide from it. Whatever this was, it was coming for me, and the only way to survive was to face it. As I settled back into bed, the faintest sound drifted through the door, barely audible but unmistakable, the soft, rhythmic beat of footsteps moving away down the hallway. The visitor at dawn. Sleep was out of the question after the night's events, yet the first light of dawn brought a fragile sense of relief. Shadows pulled back from the corners of the room, and the pounding fear of the night melted into a haze of exhaustion and dread. I lay still, clutching the page that had been slipped under my door, feeling its coarse, brittle texture between my fingers. To open a door is to invite a shadow. The words burned in my mind, as though they had embedded themselves there, and no amount of shaking my head could dislodge them. I needed answers. More than Judith's cryptic warnings and half-whispered legends. I needed to understand why this book was in my life, why the knocking, the voices, the shadows seemed drawn to me since I'd picked it up. And, more urgently, I needed to know how to make it stop. As the sun climbed higher, I dressed quickly and made my way back to the library, clutching the book and the torn page as I went. The streets were quiet, empty, as if the world itself had taken a step back to give me space. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of eyes following me from hidden corners, but I kept my focus on the destination, unwilling to let paranoia cloud my thoughts. The library loomed ahead, its old brick facade casting long shadows in the morning light. I hurried inside, relieved to find the space empty, the silence a comforting cocoon. Judith wasn't behind the desk, but I knew where to find her. She often spent her mornings in the rare book room, where she cataloged and tended to the oldest, most fragile volumes the library held. I moved quickly, clutching the book and the paper like a lifeline as I walked through the maze of shelves. The rare book room was dimly lit, with only a single window casting a soft glow over rows of ancient leather-bound volumes. Judith was there, her back to me, carefully examining a tattered, yellowed manuscript. She looked up as I entered, and her eyes widened slightly when she saw the book in my hands. "So it's already begun," she murmured, closing the manuscript gently before turning to face me fully. Her expression was solemn, her gaze intense. "You saw them, didn't you?" I nodded, the memory of the knock, the voices, and the childlike plea tightening my throat. "I didn't open the door, but they didn't leave empty-handed," I whispered, holding out the torn page. "They left this for me. I don't understand why." Judith took the page carefully, examining the faded script and the strange symbols scrawled beneath the words. Her face grew even more grave, and she sighed heavily, as though she'd seen this all before. "This page," she said, her voice soft, "was torn from the Grimoire of Shadows, a book older than any record we have, even in the oldest libraries. It's said to contain secrets of doors, doors between worlds, between dimensions. Most of it is indecipherable now, except for pieces like this, fragments with just enough power to draw interest from certain entities. I felt a chill run through me as she spoke. "What do they want?" I asked. "Why are they coming for me?" Judith's gaze didn't waver. The book acts as a beacon. Every time it's opened, it sends out a kind of signal, a ripple that these beings are attuned to. It's why the men in black, the women in black, and the black-eyed children are drawn to it. They are custodians in a sense, but not all of them are there to protect people. Some are there to protect the knowledge inside the book. She paused, her expression unreadable. And some are there to make sure that knowledge remains locked away. To open the book is to invite them, willingly or not, to your door. The weight of her words settled over me like a shroud, but I couldn't stop the question that had been burning in my mind since the first night. And the page, what does it mean? To open a door is to invite a shadow. Is it a warning? Judith's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's a promise," she said quietly. "Each door opened brings a new shadow, a force that seeks to latch on to the one who opened it. They're drawn to the curiosity, the act of reaching beyond. You've already started down this path, and now, they won't stop until they have what they came for." I swallowed hard, a knot of fear forming in my stomach. Is there any way to make them stop, to close the door? Judith hesitated, glancing down at the page as though weighing her words. "There is a ritual, but it's incomplete. The grimoire is missing pages, instructions lost to time. What remains is fragmented, barely enough to hold them back for a short while. But to seal the door permanently..." She trailed off, looking at me with a kind of reluctant pity. "You would need to find the missing pages. Only a completed ritual could stop them from following you." I felt a surge of both hope and dread. The thought of gathering these lost fragments felt impossible, yet it was the only chance I had to escape. Where do I start? Where are the other pages? Judith's gaze grew distant, her fingers tracing the edge of the torn page thoughtfully. "The pages are scattered, hidden in places where the line between our world and theirs is thin, where shadows gather and linger. Some say that they're held by people, others by entities like the ones you saw. But you must be careful, because each page you find will draw more attention, and the shadows will grow stronger." She took a deep breath, placing a hand on my shoulder. "If you're truly set on this path, I'll help you. There's an old map I have, one that marks locations rumored to contain relics tied to the grimoire. But I must warn you, each step you take will bring them closer. You must be prepared for what that means." I nodded, feeling the weight of her warning, but knowing I had no choice. The shadows were already at my door. There was no way to turn back now. Judith disappeared into the back of the rare book room, returning with a worn, yellowed map that looked as ancient as the grimoire itself. She spread it out on the table, her fingers tracing a series of small, red, inked X's, marking various locations across the country. Small towns, remote forests, abandoned churches, forgotten libraries. "This map," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "is the closest thing to a guide you'll have. Each of these marks represents a place where shadows are known to gather, where the boundary between our world and theirs is weakest. If there are missing pages to be found, they'll be in these places." I studied the map, a sense of dread clawing at me as I traced the faded lines and inked symbols. Each mark seemed to pulse with its own energy, a faint promise of something dark and ancient waiting just out of sight. My eyes landed on a town just a few miles north, marked with a small red X next to an abandoned church. "Start there," Judith said, following my gaze. "The church has been empty for decades, but stories say it's been a place of strange gatherings, sightings. If there's a page to be found, it might be there." I looked up at her, feeling a surge of gratitude mixed with fear. "Thank you, Judith, for everything." She smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "Just be careful. The closer you get, the stronger they'll come. The first warning was just that, a warning. Next time, they may not ask permission to enter." With the map folded carefully in my pocket and the grimoire held close, I left the library. The air outside was cold, crisp, filled with the quiet tension of something waiting. As I made my way to my car, a flicker of movement caught my eye. There, standing on the other side of the street, was a figure dressed in black. A tall, thin man with an expressionless face and eyes that seemed too large, too dark. He watched me, unmoving, his gaze fixed and intent. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder only to find that he hadn't moved, his figure now just a distant shadow against the morning light. As I drove away, my heart pounded with the knowledge that the journey had truly begun. The shadows were watching, waiting. And as I sped toward the first mark on the map, I knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that there would be no turning back. The Church of Forgotten Shadows. The drive north to the abandoned church felt longer than the miles on the odometer. The sky was overcast, a bleak gray that cast everything in shades of twilight, blurring the line between day and night. The map Judith had given me rested on the passenger seat, each red X on its weathered surface feeling more like a grave marker than a destination. As I approached the small, nearly forgotten town, I caught glimpses of boarded-up shops, hollow houses with broken windows, and streets empty of life as if even time had abandoned the place. The church was exactly where the map said it would be, sitting on a small hill on the edge of town, its silhouette stark against the sky. Its steeple leaned precariously, the wood darkened with age, and ivy crept up its walls as though trying to pull the building back into the earth. There was a profound stillness around it, a kind of waiting silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I parked the car and stepped out, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path that led up to the church. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though some invisible weight were pressing down on me, urging me to turn back. I could almost hear Judith's warning in my mind, whispering that each page I found would draw the shadows closer. But turning back wasn't an option. The only way out was forward. As I reached the front doors, I noticed they were slightly ajar, a narrow gap just wide enough to invite me in. Taking a deep breath, I pushed them open, the old wood creaking as I stepped inside. The interior was cloaked in shadows, the pews empty, blanketed in dust and cobwebs that stretched from row to row like ghostly shrouds. Broken stained glass windows cast fractured light across the floor, shards of red, blue, and green flickering over the walls like fragments of memory. The air was cold, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent that reminded me of old blood and something else. Something older, earth or decay. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw a dark shape at the far end of the aisle. The altar. The map had hinted that a page of the Grimoire might be hidden here, but it hadn't said where. I moved forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence, each step stirring up small clouds of dust that drifted lazily in the faint light. As I approached the altar, I saw that it was covered with strange carvings, symbols I didn't recognize. Spirals and lines that seemed to twist and coil as though they were alive, moving in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. I reached out to touch one of them, my fingers brushing the rough, weathered wood, and felt a strange pulse beneath my fingertips, as though the altar itself had a heartbeat. A sudden chill passed over me, and I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. Standing in the shadows at the far end of the church was a figure. A man, tall and thin, dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was pale, almost waxen, his eyes dark and unblinking as he watched me. There was something wrong about him, something deeply unnatural, as though he were merely imitating a human form. "Why have you come here?" he asked, his voice a low murmur that echoed through the empty church. It was a simple question, but there was a menace beneath the words, a silent threat that hung heavy in the air. I took a step back, my heart pounding, but forced myself to keep my voice steady. "I'm looking for something, a page," I said, surprised at the strength in my own voice. "I know it's here." The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You do not understand what you seek. Some doors are meant to remain closed. To look beyond them is to invite consequences." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought I saw something shifting behind them, a darkness deeper than the black of his pupils. "I don't have a choice," I replied, clutching the map tightly. "They've already come for me. I need to find a way to stop them." A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, or disdain, passed over his face. "You believe these pages will save you? You believe you can gather fragments of something ancient and bind it with your will? You are not the first to try, and you will not be the last to fail." I felt a surge of defiance rise within me, a stubborn refusal to let him shake me. "Maybe so," I said, "but I have to try. Where is the page?" The man's gaze lingered on me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he gestured toward the altar. "It is here, in the shadow of what was once sacred. But be warned, the page is not merely ink and paper. It is a piece of what lies beyond. To touch it is to draw closer to the darkness." I nodded, my hand trembling as I reached forward, searching for some hidden compartment or loose panel. My fingers brushed over a faint groove in the wood, and as I pressed down, a hidden drawer slid open with a soft click. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper, the edges frayed and brittle, covered in symbols that seemed to pulse faintly with their own dark energy. I reached for it, hesitating for just a moment as the man's warning echoed in my mind. But before I could pull back, my fingers brushed the page, and a shock ran through me. cold and electric, as though the paper itself were alive. I gasped, the breath knocked out of me as a rush of images filled my mind. Fractured, chaotic glimpses of other places, other realms, each one darker and stranger than the last. I saw vast, shadowed landscapes beneath blood-red skies, towers that stretched into the void, creatures with eyes like black mirrors watching from the darkness. I saw doors, endless doors, each one leading to places I couldn't comprehend, each one guarded by beings older and colder than time itself. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the vision faded, leaving me breathless and disoriented. The page clutched tightly in my hand. I looked up, blinking to clear the haze from my vision, but the man in black was gone, leaving only an empty church filled with shadows. The silence pressed down on me, a heavy, suffocating weight. I felt as though the walls themselves were watching, waiting for me to leave, and I didn't need any more encouragement. Tucking the page carefully into my coat, I turned and made my way back down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. As I stepped outside, the air felt colder, sharper, as though the world itself had shifted in some subtle, sinister way. I took a deep breath, feeling the chill settle in my lungs, and glanced back at the church. The figure of the man in black was there again, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes following me as I made my way to the car. I climbed in, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel and started the engine. As I drove away, I could feel the weight of the page in my pocket, a dark presence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The images I'd seen haunted me, lingering in the corners of my mind, hints of something vast and malevolent waiting just beyond the edge of reality. The journey back felt endless, each mile stretched thin with the weight of what I carried. By the time I returned to my apartment, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. I closed the door behind me, locking it carefully, and placed the page on the table, staring at it as though it might come to life and speak. And then, as darkness fell, the knock came again. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the silence of my apartment. This time there was no voice, no pleading, only the steady, relentless knocking. It felt heavier, more insistent, as though whoever, or whatever, stood outside had lost patience. My hand hovered over the page, the symbols blurring in the dim light, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that the shadows were closer now. Closer and hungrier. The page held a power I didn't yet understand, but it was also a beacon, a signal calling them to me. The knock grew louder, a steady drumbeat that filled the room, each knock a reminder of the doors I had opened and the darkness I had invited in. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and reached for the chalk Judith had given me, drawing a fresh circle around the table. The knock paused, as though whatever was outside could feel the boundary I'd drawn, could sense my resistance. For now, it held, but I knew it was only a matter of time. The shadows had found me, and they would not stop until every door was open. Into the shadows, the knocking didn't stop that night. It grew louder, more insistent, each blow against the door like a hammer to my spine. I clutched the chalk circle, my heart pounding, the page I had taken from the church lying on the table like a dark promise. Every fiber of my being knew that I had crossed a threshold, one I couldn't retreat from. Each step into this darkness had only led me deeper, closer to whatever lay behind the door I'd opened. I'd wanted answers. Now I feared what I might find. When dawn finally broke, the knocking ceased. The silence that followed was as deep and suffocating as the knocking had been loud. I stayed within the chalk circle until the first rays of sunlight crept across the floor, then carefully lifted the page, tucking it into my coat. I couldn't stay here anymore. I needed to understand, to find the final pieces of the grimoire, and to end this once and for all. The next mark on the map was in the mountains, miles from civilization. According to Judith's notes, it was an old, abandoned observatory, built on a summit where the stars supposedly spoke to those who listened. The locals had long avoided it, claiming strange things happened to those who stayed there after dark. It sounded as if it was precisely the kind of place the next piece of the grimoire might be. I packed what little I needed, grabbed the map, and left my apartment. I could feel the shadows watching me as I drove, every empty intersection and darkened storefront hiding the hints of movement just at the edge of my vision. The further I traveled, the stronger the feeling became, as though an invisible thread was pulling me toward the observatory. The observatory. The observatory loomed against the twilight sky, its domed roof cracked and rusted, the large telescope inside like a watchful eye turned toward the heavens. The air was sharp, cold, biting through my coat as I climbed the rocky path up to the entrance. The building itself was silent, but it felt alive somehow, like it had absorbed years of stargazing, Secrets whispered beneath the stars. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The walls were lined with faded maps of constellations, their ink smudged and worn. Dust coated the floor, disturbed only by faint footprints leading toward a staircase that spiraled up to the dome. Taking a deep breath, I followed them, the air growing colder as I ascended, a chill seeping into my bones that had nothing to do with the mountain's altitude. At the top, the telescope pointed skyward, framed by a large open window that revealed the darkening sky above. The room was empty, save for a small ornate pedestal in the center. On it lay another page, identical in size and texture to the one I'd taken from the church. Symbols similar to those on the first page covered its surface, swirling patterns that seemed to shift as I looked at them, their meanings elusive and mysterious. I approached the page, my heart pounding. The moment my fingers touched the rough paper, a wave of darkness swept through me, stronger than anything I'd felt before. Images flooded my mind, visions of other worlds, endless voids, and creatures that lurked in the darkness between stars. I saw ancient doorways, portals that opened to places where the rules of reality no longer applied. And then I saw something else, something familiar. It was the church from the first page's vision, its doors thrown wide open, shadows spilling from within. But this time, the man in black was not alone. Dozens of figures crowded the doorway, their eyes black and expressionless, their mouths open in silent screams. And behind them, deeper in the darkness, I glimpsed a larger shadow, something vast and formless, shifting and writhing like smoke. The vision vanished, and I staggered back, clutching the page. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized what I'd seen. Each page I collected was drawing me closer to that shadow, that ancient darkness that lay waiting behind the door. The Grimoire wasn't just a collection of forbidden knowledge. It was a map, a guide to opening a doorway that could bring that darkness into our world. I knew then that I couldn't continue. The path I was on didn't lead to salvation. It led to an abyss. I had to find a way to destroy the pages, to break the Grimoire's hold on me before it was too late. A deal with shadows. As I left the observatory, I saw them waiting at the edge of the trees, figures dressed in black, their faces pale and eyes glinting in the dim light. They watched in silence, their expressions blank, but I could feel their intent, their patience, as though they knew I was on the verge of surrender. I held up the 2 pages, my voice steady despite the fear rising within me. "I know what this is now," I called out to them. "I know what you're trying to make me do. But I won't open the door. I won't let it in." The figures didn't move, their eyes fixed on the pages in my hands. One of them, a man with a thin, unnaturally wide smile, stepped forward, his movements smooth and deliberate. "It is already too late," he said softly, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "The door has been opened. You hold its pieces, and its call is stronger than your will." I took a step back, clutching the pages tightly. "Then I'll destroy them. I'll burn every last page if that's what it takes." The man's smile widened, a hollow, empty grin. "You cannot destroy what is bound by shadow, but you may make a bargain." I hesitated, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. "What kind of bargain?" "Return the pages to their place," he said, gesturing to the observatory behind me. "Place them upon the altar, where they were first bound, and leave. If you do this, the shadows will be sated. You will be free." I glanced back at the observatory, a chill running through me. I wanted to believe him, but something in his tone felt wrong, a hint of deception lurking beneath his words. "And what happens to the door?" I asked. "Will it stay closed?" The man's smile faded, his expression becoming serious. "The door will remain as it was, in shadows, in silence, beyond the reach of those who know not what they seek." I weighed his words, feeling the pull of the pages in my hands. They vibrated faintly, a hum of dark energy that felt like a heartbeat. I knew I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep drawing the shadows closer. The bargain was my only hope. Slowly I nodded. "I'll do it." The final offering, I walked back into the observatory, the shadows gathering around me as I placed the pages on the altar. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The pages lay side by side, their symbols pulsing faintly, casting a sickly green glow across the dark stone. As I stepped back, the shadows thickened, swirling around the altar, merging and shifting until they formed a doorway, a dark portal that flickered and pulsed, a threshold to the world beyond. I could see shapes moving within, faint, shifting forms that seemed to writhe and twist, as though drawn by the presence of the pages. The man in black appeared at my side, his expression unreadable. "You have done as promised," he said softly. "Now you may go." But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. The doorway, The portal was growing, its edges expanding, tendrils of darkness spilling out and coiling around the room. The altar began to tremble, and the air filled with a low, rumbling sound like the growl of something vast and hungry. I turned to the man, panic rising in my chest. "You said the door would stay closed." He smiled, a glint of triumph in his dark eyes. "I said it would remain as it was, and it has, open but bound. Thanks to you, its bindings are now complete." Realization struck me like a blow. I had restored the grimoire, reassembled the pieces that had kept the door half closed, half bound. By gathering the pages, I hadn't protected myself. I had sealed my own fate. I had invited the shadows in. The darkness surged forward, spilling from the portal, filling the room. I tried to scream, but the shadows swallowed the sound, pressing in around me, cold and suffocating, until I could feel nothing but their crushing weight. My vision blurred, the room fading as the darkness consumed me, pulling me into its depths. The empty room. When they found the observatory weeks later, the place was untouched, as though nothing strange had ever happened there. The altar was empty, the pages gone. The locals whispered that the shadows had claimed another soul, that the grimoire had taken what it needed. And somewhere, in the small, forgotten towns and lonely roads of the world, people continued to hear strange knocks at their doors, voices in the night whispering from the darkness. The door had opened, and it would never truly close again. In the end, I learned that some mysteries are never meant to be unraveled, and some knowledge holds a cost too high for any mortal to pay. I thought I sought answers, a way to silence the shadows, to quell the terror that had haunted my every step. But in my pursuit of the truth, I found only an abyss staring back, an ancient darkness that waits patiently, endlessly, for those curious or reckless enough to open the door. The shadows had whispered promises of secrets, of power and understanding, but they had only traded fear for emptiness, hope for dread. Now, the echoes of that darkness linger, filling me with an aching sorrow, a deep understanding of just how thin the veil between our world and theirs truly is. I see now that peace lies not in knowing, but in leaving some doors unopened, in respecting the silent boundaries that guard us from the depths. If I've learned anything, it's this. Sometimes the shadows aren't meant to be chased, and sometimes the light is best preserved by leaving the darkness uninvited behind closed doors. Thank you for watching the story. If you find the video interesting and meaningful, please comment 0 and subscribe to the channel M.I.B Stories. We will bring many interesting and meaningful stories to our audience. Once again, thank you everyone for listening.